What's it like being at the center of the biggest story in Toronto right now?
Over the years, I've kind of gotten used to speaking to the media and being on camera, and the attention is really short-lived. So, you know, you're up there, and with experience, you learn how to answer the questions and deal with the questions. And then, I guess, the notoriety of being the center of attention. In this case, more than any other, it's quite something. I've literally been stopped on the street by complete strangers thanking me and thanking my team for the work that we've done, and I've never had that happen before. So, but like I said, I know it will eventually fade away and other stories will take precedence.
But as an officer, and you are an experienced one, being at the center of such a horrific story, what's that like?
There's a lot of pressure. But you know, I've been in homicide for a long time. There's always a lot of pressure in this job. Police work, in general, it's not easy. It's even more difficult to be an accomplished, good police officer. And no doubt, the work we do in homicide is some of the most difficult work that you can do on this job. So when you're trying to balance that work and also trying to balance dealing with the media and getting what information out to the public that you can get out, it's more than a full-time job, that's for sure.
It's unusual, and we welcome it as the media, to have the opportunity to sit down with the lead detective of a case that's still being investigated. Why did you make that decision to be so accessible?
If you don't provide the right information to the media, they'll grasp onto rumors, and they'll spin those rumors. And a lot of times it looks very negative against the police service. I think it's far easier to get out what you can get out, and what you can't get out, explain why you can't put that out. And it really does quell the rumors. I think you can actually watch the media coverage of this incident since January 17th, and the stories were coming from all over the place for the first couple of days. But then once it settles down, I think people have a really good idea of what went on here and where we're going.
Where are you going with this? I mean, what can you tell us about what evidence you've gathered so far? We know about the planters.
Where we're going right now is we're looking at the evidence that we've got. We've got the planters, we've got the remains of at least 6 individuals. We've identified some of those remains. We're still working on identifying the remainders of those. We've got 5 murder charges. I anticipate there's going to be more. I don't know how many more there are going to be. But just dealing with that, what we concretely have, is a very time-consuming process. You can imagine the logistics of running not one murder prosecution, but 5 murder prosecutions. So it's going to take a lot of work by a lot of guys to get that underway. In addition to that, we're still looking at other properties. We're still looking at further evidence. We've got evidence in at the Center of Forensic Sciences, and depending on what comes back with that evidence, we'll determine other steps that we're going to take. And then, of course, we've got a lot of historic missing persons cases, a lot of historic unsolved murders, and we're taking a look at some of those and seeing if we can establish any links to Mr. Macarthur, and then that will open up more avenues of investigation.
Aside from the planters, what kind of other evidence is your forensic team looking at?
Well, we're still going through Mr. Macarthur's apartment. We've been there since January the 18th. We're continuing to work on that. I was speaking to one of the forensic officers this morning, and it's been almost a month that they've been in there, and they're still going. And they're very proud of the work that they're doing. There's actually been some wrestling back and forth with some officers wanting to come in and assist, and the officers who are there saying, "No, I've got it. I've been here since day one. I'm going to continue on because it's important work that they're doing."
What are they looking for? What's taking so long?
Well, you can look for in a standard crime scene. I mean, there's a million things you could be looking for. In a scene like this, you're literally going from the front door of that apartment and examining every square inch of that apartment. You're looking for human hair, you're looking for blood, you're looking for semen or any other source of DNA. That's step number one. You're fingerprinting every surface, right? You're taking every article of clothing. You're examining every article of clothing. It's a hugely time-consuming process, and it took them essentially over a week just to go through and do the what we call trace examination of the surfaces. Like I said, taping for hairs and fibers and whatnot. So it's taking quite some time.
And in terms of what's going on at the lab, what are the investigators there trying to piece together?
Well, the forensic pathologists are going through the remains that we've recovered from the planters and literally trying to piece those remains together. We have several different ways of identifying those remains, fingerprints, dental records, DNA. So that takes quite a bit of time if you have to resort to DNA to identify the remains. And then with some of the remains, that's exactly what we're doing. As far as lab work goes, different items that have been seized from different scenes or different premises. Again, you're looking for blood, you're looking for any source of DNA really on those items. And if you identify DNA, fingerprints, whatever, from any of those items that came from a particular residence, well, now you have the grounds to do an even more thorough search of that residence, which you might not have right now. So it could open up a lot of different residences where we're going to go back and take another look.
It sounds at the apartment anyway to be a very painstaking process.
Definitely.
Do you believe that some of the victims or all of the victims were killed there?
We believe that some of the victims were killed there, yes.
Why do you believe that?
That I can't get into.
It's one of those more gruesome questions, but where were these crimes executed in terms of beyond the killing? These victims that you have found so far were dismembered. Where did that happen, do you think?
We don't know. We don't know. When we arrested Mr. Macarthur on January the 18th, the big question was where are the bodies? And we didn't know on January 18th where the bodies were. And a week later, we answered part of that question when we started finding remains in the planters from Mallory. So the next question became, where did he dismember these people? And right now, I don't have an answer for that.
Has he been cooperating?
I can't comment on what he said or what he hasn't said.
And why can't you comment on that?
Well, that's going to be part of the court process down the road. That's of evidentiary value to the court process.
In terms of the charges, he's been charged with first-degree murder in the deaths of 5 people.
Right.
First-degree murder, basically, you're saying that he intended to kill these people.
Right.
Do you have the evidence to prove that he was intending and he had a list and a target when he came to these men? Well,
the first part of your question, yes, I do believe we can prove that he intended to kill those men. I've never commented on a list, never commented on anything about a list that he had.
How do you believe he operated in terms of identifying and killing his victims?
We know about his relationships with some of the victims. We don't know about his relationships with all of the victims, so that is something still being investigated. I don't know if we'll ever have an answer to that, specifically how he operated, but we do have a lot of background information, like I said, in relation to some of his relationships, and we do have some further background information on his lifestyle.
When you're talking about the charges were laid before you identified Andrew Kinsman's remains. And the lay person out there is wondering, how do you lay first-degree murder charges when you don't have the bodies?
It's very difficult, no doubt about it. I've had cases before where we certainly had evidence that someone was killed, but we didn't have the remains. But that evidence wasn't quite up to the bar that I need to lay the charge. In this case, we did have some pretty clear evidence that he had committed these offenses, and that as of January 18th, I felt we could prove that Andrew Kinsman and Selim Esen had been murdered, so we laid those charges.
And going forward, when the additional 3 charges, was that evidence something that you came across in that 11 days?
No, it was evidence that we already had, but that took some work to identify some of the victims and be able to proceed with those charges.
Is it DNA evidence?
I can't discuss exactly what that evidence was.
Why can't you discuss that?
Again, it's going to be part of the court process, and I don't want to taint the court process.
In terms of the planters that you've seized, there's about 15 so far.
Right.
And you're focusing on that. Are you planning or are you in the process of seizing more evidence or looking for more evidence beyond the apartment?
Well, we were quite some time at the residence on Mallory, and all the remains that we've recovered from the planters so far came from Mallory. We did take planters from other properties if there was something to indicate that there may be remains in those planters. We're still going through those planters. So far we haven't found any other remains in any of those that would lead us to go back to those properties where the planters came from and do some further searching and perhaps even further excavation. But if we get that evidence, then we will go back there to some of these addresses. And like I said, at least one of those other addresses, we have taken items from within the residence, and we're testing those items now as well. And depending on what those tests reveal, we'll go where the evidence takes us, where it tells us to go.
So when did Bruce McArthur get in police's radar?
Well, it's a bit of a tough question to answer. I can tell you that in September of 2017, we uncovered some evidence that led us to believe that Mr. McArthur may have had something to do with the disappearance of Andrew Kinsman. So I suppose that's when he first came on to our radar.
And then subsequent to that?
Subsequent to that, we conducted our investigation, and as the months went on, we uncovered evidence which led us to believe that Andrew Kinsman had in fact been murdered, and Bruce McArthur became a suspect in that murder. That was in the early winter months of 2017, and then on January 17th of 2018, we uncovered some evidence. Actually, what we uncovered first was evidence which led us to believe that Mr. McArthur had been responsible for the murder of Selim Esen. And then later on that day, evidence which led us to believe that he was responsible for the murder of Mr. Kinsman as well.
But it sounds like it was moving quickly. You're looking at him for one murder, potential murder, and then suddenly you find evidence about another one.
Right.
Is that unusual?
Right. Very unusual. January 17th was definitely a day that really changed the direction and the scope of the investigation. I mean, we were proceeding, I guess, as normal with our investigation up until January 17th. And when we discovered what we had on January 17th, it definitely changed everything, and everything became much more rapid and focused.
When did you realize that you were after a serial killer?
We laid the charges on January the 18th in regards to Mr. Esen and Mr. Kinsman, and I was asked to label Mr. McArthur as a serial killer by the media. I wasn't comfortable doing that. There's a couple of different definitions in the media. One, I shouldn't say the media, I should say in police work. One definition is if they've killed more than one person. Another definition is if they've killed more than two. So at that time we had two victims. So like I said, I wasn't comfortable labeling him as that at that point. But when we laid the further charges about a week and a half later, then I was comfortable attaching that label. And again, it's alleged.
When he was arrested, and we have confirmed this with our own sources in the police, about the fact that when the arrest was happening, a younger gentleman who had responded to some ad, presumably who was going to his apartment, presumably to engage in a consensual act, was deemed by police to be in imminent danger. Can you speak to what led police to arrest Bruce McArthur when they did?
Well, number one, I've never confirmed those reports, and I won't comment on anonymous reports, regardless of their source. If you've got your sources and you want to report on them, that's one thing. I'm not going to confirm that. What I will state is on January 17th, we began preparing warrants for the arrest of Mr. Macarthur and for the search of various premises. And we anticipated executing those warrants several days later. And we never got that chance because on January 18th, because of something that happened, we were forced to act right away and arrest Mr. Macarthur in his apartment.
Were you there?
No, I wasn't.
Do you have an account of how that went down?
Well, we were conducting full-time surveillance on him at the time, and two of the officers from the project team were part of the surveillance team. And based on information they fed back to myself and Detective Dickinson, they were given instructions to effect the arrest of Mr. Macarthur right away.
Did he go without a fight?
He did, yes.
Were you expecting that?
I am always prepared for the worst, but you never know how someone's going to react.
Okay. And can you confirm whether or not there was anyone else in the apartment at the time?
I can't, no.
Okay. 30 properties were part of the police investigation. Can you just give me an overview of where you're at right now? We know about the 15 planters and you've addressed that. What about the rest, and what more evidence do you expect to be collecting in the next while?
We actually have more than 15 planters.
Okay. How many do you have?
Upwards of 20.
Okay.
And
these were all seized from various properties?
Various properties. So what we did was we had a client list of Mr. Macarthur. So we've had that client list for some time, and we've also conducted surveillance for some time and identified different properties where he was landscaping. And once we had Mr. Macarthur in custody, we went to these properties, and we went there with canine units that are trained to sniff out decomposition. And if the canine units gave a positive indication on any of these planters, we would take them. And we would take them, and it's the middle of winter. We had to keep them in storage. They had to be thawed before any examination could be conducted. And obviously the first ones that we focused on were the ones from Mallory. We were actually able to x-ray those and see that there were human remains inside. And after they were x-rayed, it actually still took some time for them to thaw out, and we could begin breaking those open and recovering the remains that were in there.
Were you there
So,
when they did that?
I was, yes.
What was that like?
It was it was angering. I've described this before, and I was actually angry as they were pulling these apart. So I was angry that this had gone on in this city for some time, and that someone had actually done this.
You're a veteran officer.
I am.
Do things make you angry usually?
No.
So what was it about this one?
I've got the longest fuse in the world when it comes to anger, and like I said, I was just angry that this had gone on. It had gone on for some time, and that someone had actually done this in the city of Toronto. That was angering to me.
Does it affect you as an officer the way someone is killed and the way their remains are dealt with?
Absolutely, yes.
And in this case?
I don't think you could. It'd be hard to define a more gruesome way to dispose of someone after you've killed them. It's one thing to kill them, it's quite another to dismember them, and then it's quite another to really quite callously put those remains into planters on properties of different people around the city. So I've never seen anything quite like that. I had a case in 2007 where a victim was buried in concrete and placed in a barrel and dumped into Lake Ontario. And you think, well, that's pretty gruesome. I think this certainly outdoes that.
He worked at McGregor Socks for years. We confirmed that with the company, and I'm
Right.
sure you guys have done all that. And he was traveling around the province for decades. So how far back are you looking?
Right now, we've got cases from the 1970s that we are looking at.
Related to him, potentially?
I don't know that yet, but we are looking at them to see if there are any relations to him. I don't know if we'll find that. I think the information out there about him being a traveling salesman is maybe a little exaggerated. We don't know to what extent he traveled around the province yet, but we're working on that as well.
The thinking is, and I'm sure you know this better than we, but we've spoken to experts, most people don't begin a serial killing career in their 60s.
Right.
How far back do you think this might go?
Well, like I said, we're looking at occurrences from the 1970s where he would have been in his mid-20s, mid to late 20s. You know, as a generality, you can say that people don't start this when they're in their 60s. Generally, it's in their late 20s, 30s when they begin. Right now, I have no evidence to say that Mr. Macarthur started killing people in his 20s or 30s. If I get to that point, we'll lay the appropriate charges and bring the cases to court. We're just not there yet.
You know, part of the shock of covering this story and for people to consume it is hearing, seeing images of him on Facebook with his grandkids. He was a mall Santa. He seemed on the surface to be a rather amiable, nice guy, and a lot of people have accounts of that. Have you heard similar accounts that he was, generally a nice guy? And how does it square to you as a police officer when there's this whole other persona that seems to be a very good person?
That's what makes him in particular difficult to catch. People don't suspect him. People generally don't suspect serial killers. Family and friends certainly rarely, in the case of any killers or murderers out there, will stand up and say, hey, yeah, I knew it all along, right? That they were involved in something like that. But with Mr. Macarthur, by most accounts, he certainly seemed to be the mall Santa, the kindly grandfather, the soft-spoken gentleman of the neighborhood. Obviously, there's a much different story through other accounts of him.
I do want to address the criticism from the gay community that police didn't take rumors of a serial killer seriously enough, and it was raised again as recently as last week at a vigil. How do you respond to that?
To go back historically, we had 2 men go missing from the gay village in 2010. We had another one in 2012, and there's actually several more missing persons occurrences from that time period, which would, in some respects, fit the same profile, but not quite as exact as these 3 gentlemen, being Skanda Navaratnam, Abdul Faizi, and Majeed Kayhan. And in 2012, at the end of 2012, we struck up a project, Project Houston. And I was involved in that project from late 2012 for approximately 6 months, because we had received some information which led us to believe that Skanda Navaratnam may have met with some foul play. So we had well over a dozen officers, a bigger investigative team than the current Project Prism, working on trying to locate these 3 missing men. Like I said, it started just with Skanda. And as we conducted that investigation into Skanda, we discovered the other missing person occurrences that were outstanding. So when we were able to finally discount that evidence that we had, which was in April, May of 2013.
This was evidence relating to Mr.
Skanda.
Okay.
In June of 2013, the Toronto Police Service put out a bulletin, and it was carried in every major media outlet in the city, And it was basically, we've got these 3 missing persons. And we created posters and flyers, and we said, we've got a problem. We don't know what's going on, but we've got a problem. And that investigative task force carried on for another year. So by bringing the community these outstanding missing persons occurrences, a lot of people in the community were saying, well, surely you've got a serial killer on the loose. I can't say that unless I've got evidence of that, right? The investigative team can't say that. And to be accused of not considering that is, in effect, not accurate. We're human beings. Of course, are we thinking, is that a possibility? Yes, it's a possibility. But it would be wrong of me, and it would be reckless of me to come out and say, perhaps there's a serial killer, unless I have evidence that there is a serial killer. So that task force continued on for another year after we released those bulletins. And they could find no evidence that would indicate that any of those 3 men met with foul play, right? And like I said, there are actually other outstanding missing persons that were investigated during that time frame too, but they didn't quite fit into that profile. So that project shut down in April of 2014. And it wasn't until 2017 when Selim Esen went missing in the spring, and then Andrew Kinsman went missing, that we said, okay, obviously the problem has come up again, and they created Project Prism to investigate those 2 missing men. So the critics in the community, I understand their criticism. People need to have someone to blame, and all I can do is point out to them we weren't doing nothing about it. We weren't ignoring what you were saying, but we work in a world where we need evidence to proclaim something, and we didn't have that evidence, so we're not going to say it. And that was accurate right up until January 17th of 2018, where we got that evidence, and then we were finally able to say, yes, that's what we have.
And how do you feel about the fact that you were part of Project Houston, and then one of those men ends up being named as a victim in 2018?
I wish we had that evidence in 2013. I wish we could have stopped it in 2013. We just didn't have that.
And in terms of the criticism that has been leveled about racism, homophobia, that these men were primarily brown men, for lack of a better description, did that come into play at all?
We've been criticized, and accusations have been made to that respect, completely unfounded. If they knew what went on, like I said, in 2012, we launched this very large investigation based on one gay brown man, Scandinav Ratnam, from the village. The difference between those missing persons and Andrew Kinsman was white, but Andrew Kinsman was reported within 72 hours.
The others weren't?
The others weren't. Abdul Faizi was reported, the only other one, he was reported within 24 hours by his family. Selim Esen, 2 weeks. Scandinav Ratnam, I believe, was 11 days.
What kind of impact do those days have on an investigation?
It's huge. Can you imagine someone calling me up and say, hey, I've got a murder that occurred 10 days ago, come and investigate it, right? I had a murder case last spring where there was an 8-hour delay to us being notified, and I wasn't happy with that at all. It really puts you behind the 8 ball.
How does it put you behind?
You want to be there as fast as possible. You want to get things in motion as fast as possible, right? Any murder investigation, any delay between the murder happening and you actually responding is going to hamper your investigation, make it that much more difficult. any typical murder investigation in the city of Toronto in this day and age, where you're relying on surveillance video, or you're relying on cell phones. If you get a murder 24, 48 hours after it's happened, guess what? All those cameras on the TTC are gone, right? A lot of businesses that have surveillance cameras, it's gone. The perpetrators are long gone. It has a huge impact in more ways than I could possibly articulate here.
And Kinsman, the fact that Kinsman was reported relatively quickly got the ball rolling.
Gave us a huge head start, and sure enough, a crucial piece of evidence was uncovered because of that immediate reporting. If he had been reported 7 or 8 days after he disappeared, we wouldn't be here today.
Was Bruce McArthur ever a suspect during Project Houston?
No.
We've talked to people who know that Skanda was dating him or was involved with him somehow. Did that not come up in any of the investigation into his disappearance?
It did, yes.
And did you not think it was worth talking to him?
I'm not going to say whether we talked to him or not in 2013.
So you did talk to Bruce McArthur in 2013?
I can't confirm that. Again, that would be a very crucial piece of evidence in court if that did happen.
But when you're saying, you're not dismissing it though. So is it fair to assume that you may have spoken to him then, but you didn't have evidence to tie him to Skanda's disappearance? Is that fair?
It's fair to say that at the end of Project Houston, we didn't have any evidence that Skanda had been murdered, and we didn't have any evidence. And again, we're going from the investigation into a missing person. We don't classify people as suspects into a missing person investigation. We classify people as suspects if there's been a murder, right? When you have a missing person investigation, is it possible that someone was involved in that disappearance? It's possible that they are. Is that investigated? Yes, it's investigated. In the case of Prism, it was investigated. We could establish that a murder had likely happened, and then we can classify someone as a suspect in that. So that just didn't happen in 2013.
So there was no murder suspect in 2013?
Correct.
But you're not ruling out the fact that you may have spoken to Bruce McArthur as a person of interest in trying to understand where Skanda Neveranthan had gone to?
Person of interest falls into the same category.
Okay, so as a witness potentially? What's the right word?
As someone who may or may not have knowledge, as in the case of Andrew Kinsman, may or may not have knowledge about the disappearance. Again, I'm not going to confirm what his role was in 2013, but that's essentially, if you were going to investigate an associate of any one of these missing persons, that's essentially what you'd be interviewing them for.
Just then, in terms of his conviction, Mr. McArthur's conviction for beating a man with an iron pipe, were you aware of that? Were police aware of that? Or when did you become aware of that? Because I imagine you pulled out all the records at some point, but when did you become aware of that?
I don't want to comment on any criminal record, and without getting specific about it, if someone's received a pardon for a conviction, does it have any evidentiary weight in an investigation? Not likely.
I see. So he got a pardon?
Again, I'm not going to comment
I know
on that.
he was trying to get a pardon, I wasn't sure. So, but anyway, so you don't want to comment or can't comment about his prior conviction?
Correct.
Okay. Can you give us a sense of the scale and the scope and the manpower and the hours that you and your team have put into it?
Just on Prism alone, there were over a dozen investigators assigned on a full-time basis since August of 2017. Some of those investigators also worked on Project Houston and had a real vested interest in the outcome of Project Prism. They've essentially been living this investigation from late 2012 until today, and they continue to work on it. And these are guys from 51 Division. Uniformed police officers put into an investigative role, overseen by detectives, and like I said, working around the clock on this investigation. So their personal commitment to it can't be understated. That's in addition to all the other investigators who are assigned full-time to the investigation. Like I said, more than a dozen of them. You also have to take into account the forensic officers separate from that investigative team. You're dealing with the scene at Thorncliffe, you're dealing with the scene at Mallory. So you've got a team of at least 2 officers at any given time working full-time on those different scenes. You've got the forensic officers going to these other 30 properties. Because if there's a planter that we want to seize, we can't just pick it up, throw it on a truck, and take it in. It's got to be photographed in place and carefully sealed and brought in. So you've got all those forensic officers working on that. You've got the canine units and the dogs and their handlers worked on this in the dead of winter, searching these properties. You've got officers who specialize in analyzing tech, computers, cell phones, memory cards and whatnot, working full-time, just going through all that information. Your typical home computer, if you clone it and want to look at it, you're looking at a very general number, probably over 1.5 million artifacts on that computer alone. Probably closer to 2 million on a basic home computer that you have to go through. Hundreds of thousands of files, images, emails, and whatnot. So all those officers are working on that.
Enormous.
It's enormous. I mean, they've given, once Macarthur was arrested, we've brought in another 6 officers just to help with the investigation.
You know, one of the things, now that you talk about that whole process, the remains that you've identified, the remains of at least 6 individuals, right, in the planters, and you've only identified Andrew Kinsman.
Correct.
Who do you think the others belong to?
I don't know yet. I might have an answer to that within the next few days, but right now I just can't say.
Do you think you'll eventually tie Bruce McArthur to the other missing men?
I don't know. If the evidence brings us there, I think it would be a good thing to bring some closure. But until I have that evidence, they're considered missing men. I've got no evidence to say they've been murdered yet. Right.
What does your gut tell you as a police officer?
Again, I can speculate, as I could speculate in 2013, but speculation really has no place in what we're doing.
What kind of toll has this taken on you?
I've got to say I've never had quite so many emotional moments as I've had during this investigation. Obviously, the time commitment is huge. Working around the clock for weeks on end. You know, it's going to be tough on anybody. I've already said I don't have a long fuse or anything. I tend not to get too emotional about things, but it's definitely been had an impact on not just my life, but the lives of all the officers involved.
When does this end?
I don't know. I don't know. When we stop uncovering things that we have to follow up on.
And when will you stop?
It could be years. I really don't know. One thing could lead to another. I don't know, and impossible to predict, right?
Is there a point at which you say we have enough? We have enough, even now, potentially, to put this man away for the rest of his life?
I feel that we already do. That doesn't mean we're going to stop. So we still have a lot of families out there waiting for answers, looking for answers, and hopefully we can bring some of those answers to them.